You are watching Omnis Protocol. I am Charles, also known as Omnis, and with me for this show is my fellow host of Rogue Support and the producer of the show, the man, Dylan, aka Dyzard. Thank you for doing this with me.
Absolutely. I gotta say that intro was like I'm so used to your voice and like that you do the tones the same way every single time. And then it's like watching and it's just threw me off.
Yep. We're not just listening. So before we dive into this topic of what's your counter, I do want to shout out the Space Slugs podcast and Morgan Reed as I was going back and I listened to their first episode, not the pilot, but the first episode, and Morgan kind of subtly hit on this exact thing that we're getting to in this, but I think he was just way ahead of his time. I certainly was not in this mindset at that time. And I don't even think a lot of people clicked into what he was saying. And it was just this like single answer to a single question. But I just wanted to shout them out because I really think that that was probably the first time that this concept was really presented to anyone outside of maybe just like some social context, either Morgan Reed telling his friends or his local community, or maybe someone else had stumbled onto it. But I just realized that I think other people were onto this before I was. But wanted to share kind of what I'm the way that I approach figuring out what kind of counters my list. So we're just going to run through these four things really quick. So should be fairly self-explanatory. Wounding, that is the list that are putting a lot of their advantage comes from wounding your characters or your ability to wound your opponent's characters. And then there are the revenge lists. That would be the stuff that wants to do cool things because you wounded their stuff, right? Think of Kanan, that sort of thing. Then there's the heavy displacement stuff. So anything that's got force push, that's Clan of Two. What's Darth Maul's called again?
Oh god.
You should know this. Anyway,
I should.
him
I'm
and
drawing a
him and
blank,
Django have got
man.
to like pull you off a point. Any of the like guaranteed displacement or just in general characters that displace really easily. Um, and then there's also relocation is kind of one that I've been talking about a lot, and that would be the teams that really just do an amazing job of putting characters back onto points. And you see it all the time, but it's never been something that I felt like this is the list that's dominating the meta. But it's still a really important note, and you can always tell when you start a struggle 3 and like, wow, how did my opponent just get models onto every point so fast? And it's like, they're playing a relocation list. They just move around more characters than you do. Diz, do you want to add anything to those kind of simple breakdowns?
No, I think it's best when approaching this, and I think you and I have talked about this many, many times. And early on in the game, we were very much, how are we going to like define an archetype in this game? And I think we tried overcomplicating it. And I think what you're doing great here is keeping it simple and not overreaching. I think you can pretty much put anything into one of these categories and defined in this way be fine with how the game is currently as of right now, September
Yeah.
of 2024.
And I think even if you build something that meets the kind of criteria that we're talking about, it still has to be a good list, right? Like
Yeah.
just because you do a lot of relocation does not necessarily mean you're a good list. You still have to think about how well do you do it from a force efficiency perspective? How durable is your list, right? How consistent is your list with the order deck? So there are still other factors that kind of affect whether or not the list is actually good, but this is to kind of help figure out what your list is good at and what is going to counter you. And so starting off, we're going to kind of go the same order. So wounding list, think about something like Iden and Vader 2, right? These are two characters that both as primaries have a really good chance of wounding a character on their activation. And then Iden's going to bring Hask and the ISF most likely, who also are very likely to wound characters. So this would be a really prime example of probably the biggest kind of boogeyman of the meta at the moment. That is a very wounding focused team. And I'm not saying it doesn't do other things as well, but it gets a lot of its advantage from wounding.
Mm-hmm.
Dyzard, do you have another example of what would be a great wounding focused team?
Oh, I sure do. Let's go back to the old days of the terror
Back
that
in the
was
day.
the good old terror that was Vader 1 and General Grievous that terrorized the local scenes across the globe. I think the biggest thing to think about, and like what I think the hardest thing to talk about wounding though is like wounding is a critical part to the game. But when you're looking at the likes of Iden and Vader 2 or Vader 1 and General Grievous, is these are lists that I anytime my opponent has a draw, I would not be surprised if one of my characters just dies. And that is just the way the name of the game. That's just what happens in that type of game. Stuff dies really easy, and you kind of have to work around that with that in your mind.
Yeah, we played one game in person ever, and that was my first game playing Vader 1 and General Grievous, and actually my first game ever with General Grievous. And yeah, we've literally like played that out in person. And yeah, it's still, if it's just random game store game night, someone could bust that out, and you've got to be thinking about the fact that you're going to lose characters. They're not going to be contesting points. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop over to revenge next. This is kind of the very natural. Um, I think what we're seeing at the moment is Kanan and Leia would be a great example of a very revenge focused list. Kanan obviously has some restrictions where he's only going to get his actual attack if it's a Spectre who gets wounded, but any rebel he still gets to heal to and jump, which is still going to put you back in favor in some way. It could be, removing the disarm that Iden ends up putting on another character, right? It still has positive effect, and then Leia can shoot range 5, and any rebel you kill, she's gonna, and it doesn't even have to be an attack. Um, and so those two in combination, they just create a lot of effect where if you get a wound, then those figures punish you for doing that. And it just makes wounding a lot less beneficial. So, um, Dyzard, do you have another example? Are we going back in the day again for another revenge
Oh,
example?
I guess I'm old man winner, you know.
Yeah,
father time. We're going back. We're gonna take
Bombadil.
it back. I mean, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna side tangent.
Yeah, I
Anyways,
appreciate
Mother
you.
Dooku is a really good revenge style list. It's focusing on being able to punish you for trying to play the game, and that's one of the biggest key points of revenge. It's punishing you for playing the game. And I think one of the biggest things to think about here when we're talking about revenge, yes, there are many characters throughout the game that have revenge triggers, but at its core, that is not like the game plan of the list where we're talking about Kanan Leia, Mother Dooku, and I'm sure we have another one we're gonna throw out here. But like these lists like thrive and work because of this extra little mechanic being thrown in there, and it is a key component to the play style of that list. I think that's one of the big focuses we're trying to hit on here is thinking about the key components within this realm of verbiage.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, we are going to add another one. Phil has really kind of represented with the Mandalorian and Ahsoka list, which is very different. It's still a revenge list, but it's not making nearly as many revenge attacks. It's generating a lot of healing and a lot of movement in response, which can still punish those lists that are getting the wounds. And so there's a wide range of these to think about. It's not just a couple of things. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but let's go ahead and hop into displacement. And I think this was, to a certain extent, probably the first one that we kind of started zoning in on as the game came out. We're immediately, I think both you and I were kind of attracted to these characters who were like, oh, guaranteed pushes and pulls. I love it. Yeah, let's send your characters flying across the board. Um, but a really common one at the moment, and I think it's probably fair to say that Amon has been one of the leading forces in pushing how good Mando Maul combination is, and it will often even include other characters like Django, maybe even Fifth Brother as well, where there's a lot of guaranteed displacement that does not require rolls. And so it's a very consistent benefit, and it's very very strong. And so I think these kind of lists have always been a part of the game, but it's important to identify their role. Dyzard, which one did you want to shout out?
Oh, I think that I'm not gonna do the list as a whole, but I'm gonna do the characters part here because I think these are one of the things that just can sway a game, can go into any list and kind of sway your list to being like more of a hybrid mix of multiple of these like faucets, right? And that's gonna be Fifth Brother and Django. I think both of these characters, when they can just get slotted into a list, can just change the tone of what that list is trying to be doing. And it's not like your primary. So your primary, who, in my opinion, I think the primaries are more like directing the direction when we're looking at this. But when you throw Fifth Brother or Django in there, who have amazing displacement abilities, it just turns the list into a whole nother animal. Like if I had, let's just say, Mother Dooku, and then I throw Django and Brother in that list, not only am I a revenge list, but now I'm revenge and displacement. I think being able to splash characters like this, like secondaries and supports that have these types of abilities, just completely alter what you're doing. And I like you said, we love displacement. It's so much fun to
Yeah.
just get it going.
Well, yeah, and you've got like Barris with Force Push. You've got Boosh. The Stormtroopers have guaranteed displacement as well. Even you got a little
Eh.
bit on Wrecker. They have it. Whether or not
They
they're a
have
good
it.
model is a totally different discussion. But I also want to shout out in this part that I think characters like Dooku, who don't really need to spend any force and bring
Mm.
4 force, can facilitate characters like Django being able to always jump and pull people off points, or Fifth Brother being able to repulse, or Asajj being able to force push. And so I do think those characters that help with the force economy can be a big deal for a displacement list to kind of like function and be good. So just some shout outs there. So now relocation, which we've always had relocation lists, but I don't think people have zoomed in on why they can be so strong and where they fit in. And I think we're mentioning Dooku a lot, to be honest. I think that guy's a little
he's
underrated at the
he's
moment.
he's just really good at everything.
Yeah. But Dooku and General Grievous was something that I don't think people realized how good it was, like very initially, because of how much attention Vader 1 was getting. But even now, you see people do well with a Dooku Grievous combination and kind of like all of the battle droids, right? They'll like have the B2s, they'll have Magna Guards, they'll have um, Kraken. Maybe even you do a build that has Kalani and the B1, so you just have maximum relocation. But it's crazy. Like this list can just at any moment put 3 or 4 characters back onto points, and that is how you win Shatterpoint.
Yeah.
And I know relocation has kind of been your jam of late. So what do you want to shout out here?
And I can't talk about Shatterpoint lately without talking about my boy Thrawn.
Yeah.
This I honestly, and I'm gonna say, you can at me in the comments, you can yell at me and tell me I'm wrong, but I honestly think that Thrawn might be the king of relocation at this point of the game. Like he just brings so much of it to the table. That might change here soon. Who knows? Like, who knows what's coming? But it's like the fact that you get it spread out or combined. But he just brings what he's got: the reserve mechanic, he's got the battle tactics. You're typically bringing Stormtrooper Sergeant with him, which brings another relocation. And then like you just really like his list just feels so good when you double down on it. And then when you're pairing him with Gideon, who also has relocation on himself, oh my god! Like like
Yeah.
Thrawn is. I really do think Thrawn is the Sakine of relocation of the game currently. There's some good options. I think Leia is another. Like not list specific, but like Leia herself is really good
Yeah.
at relocation. But right now, I would honestly say Thrawn is, and it makes your opponent have to constantly be thinking about what are you gonna do that you're just gonna randomly take a point from me, and I can't do anything about it because like you just drew a card or you used an ability. And that's one of the craziest things about the relocation is it always catches your opponent like on the back foot, and it keeps them there because it's just very few places that can just swarm a board with relocation abilities.
Well, and you heard me talk about it in the second game of the first GT that I played in. Uh, my opponent's first round of the third struggle was reserve Thrawn. So Thrawn moves on to a point, and then battle tactics, and then like activate dark troopers or some shit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just so many things moved onto points. It was almost unbeatable in that moment.
It's
And
great.
yeah, and obviously that stuff will usually be spread out, but I think you are probably right that Thrawn is probably the king of this, in the sense that the fact that the way that reserve mechanic is, where basically any activation could be also moving something on, right? No
Mm-hmm.
other relocation team can be like, oh, well, I'm going to move the dark troopers onto a point, but I also got to reserve someone and move Vader onto a point, or whoever, right? And so the fact that that sort of thing can combo with just about anything and can happen like every other activation if you want it to, right? You have to activate the reserved character eventually.
Yeah.
Um, but
Honestly,
just the fact that
I was gonna say this is probably why Thrawn has 2 force, because if he brought 3, you're doing this so much that it's
yeah,
just insane.
yeah, it
Like,
would there was definitely a point when it would become unfair, and you know, yeah, it's it is certainly a list that just brings that relocation in a huge way. So the reason why we wanted to kind of break these things down first, because now we want to discuss kind of how they end up countering each other. And it's kind of a very natural thing. And I think as soon as I say it, it's going to make total sense to you. And you're like, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking anyway. And I just didn't put it into words yet. Um, but obviously, we already kind of talked about it. Wounding can struggle into revenge lists, because naturally, if you want Iden and Vader to go out there and get a wound, you now are suffering a consequence every single time that happens, and maybe multiple consequences, where you're giving your opponent additional movement, you are healing up other characters, you are then also trading a wound, but then softening up a character so that then the revenge list can kind of become a wounding list. Do you have any good examples here that you want to toss out of how revenge is kind of a struggle for the wounding list?
I think one of the coolest things that you can look at is, like, if you go back through the Longshanks data of all the GTs of, basically, let's just say Iden comes out. Iden comes out and, like, wow, she's like everywhere. Okay, Kanan comes out. Now we start seeing a lot less Iden, and to where the point where it's like most of these GTs don't have very much
Yeah.
Iden anymore.
Well,
Like,
yeah,
it was
what
just
what
almost a
happened?
direct counter. Like, so you kind of see this in, like, the people who go to these events are looking at this and think about this like, well, there's gonna be a bunch of Iden. I'm gonna take a revenge list so I can go into it. And you see this discussion happen amongst podcasters, communities, discords, everything, that where it's like, well, what's your plan into the woundless? Are you going to be going revenge, or are you going to be doing this? And there's a lot of people that have, like, just splashed in maybe a little flavor of revenge, just so when they run into that item, they have a plan for it.
Yeah, like there's a lot of lists out there that you go, well, I don't really want to play into Iden, so I'm going to bring a revenge list as
Mm-hmm.
well. And I think when we say list, we kind of mean like a squad combo, a strike
Yeah.
team. So in like Premiere, you would have two combos or two strike teams that you intend to play separately. And so you would go, oh well, I want to play this thing, but I feel like these wounding lists kind of scare me. And revenge can then come in and kind of like fill that gap for you if you see someone who you think wants to drop wounding into you. I will also say one of the nice things about playing revenge is that there's this mental aspect to it where, okay, this bad thing happened to me and you just spiked and wounded my character, but I get to use Luminara to heal 3 off of one of my characters, and Mando gets to heal those 2 damage off of him and move back onto a point. And so even if those aren't super impactful, there is this mental aspect that kind of recovers you and puts you back into it and keeps you in it, and you never feel too bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that was just an important shout. But revenge also can struggle versus the displacement team. This is something that you heard a lot on, like, say, Hello There, where um, Amon realized that people wanted to drop revenge, like Mando and Ahsoka, into his Iden Vader 2. And so he brought Mando Maul as a heavy displacement list that also had Django, that also had Fifth Brother. And then suddenly it was something that didn't care about wounding. And it's like, okay, so all of that power of those characters that's based around getting those revenge triggers. I don't care. I'm just going to literally just push you off points, and maybe I'll get like 1 or 2 wounds or something, but it's going to be at very select moments, and I'm going to accept that it doesn't matter that much in that moment. You've kind of always played Maul, and you played a lot of Mother. So I feel like the kind of revenge and displacement is a lot of your jam too.
hmm I like having. I guess I don't know. I guess I'm a reactive player when it comes down to it, because even like relocation, you're still going kind of reactive in a way. You're
Yeah.
proactive and reactive. It kind of like goes back and forth, whatever your time of the game it is. But I do think that like displacement does help against revenge, because you don't need to kill anything. Like, you're just like, ah, I'm just gonna pull you off the point. What are you gonna do? Like, and it's just, you kind of just get that like high and mighty attitude about it, because you're just like, move, knave, like.
Yeah.
But I do think it just comes down to that. It's just like you're getting around what that list wants you to do to them, and you don't need to do it, and you're just like, well, I'm gonna shove you, I'm gonna stop really on my tree, I'm gonna put conditions out, I'm gonna move you, and you're not going to be able to get any of your triggers off. And cool, now your game plan is basically ineffective. A lot of these games you'll see be like 1 wound on both sides, and it's insane. Like, 1 wound games are like scary to me, because it's like that's a thinking game. That is very much
Yeah.
like who made the first mistake, who capitalized on a certain thing. Those are like 1 wound games are thinking games.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've all been in that situation, right? Where you're in that close game, and then all of a sudden you're like, if I pull Asajj or Darth Maul or the Mandalorian or Django in this moment, I win. And then you flip them and you're just like, I got the
Ooh.
Force, game over,
Yeah.
And those can just be really powerful, because we've also been in that situation, right, where you're like, I gotta shove on the second box, right, 2 down my tree, and I will shove you off this point and win the game. And then you look down at your dice and you're like, that's a lot of fails. Not feeling great about that now. That's happened, but the
Yeah.
displacement, I think anytime you can work in some displacement into your team, you're in a good spot. But we've all been in the situation where displacement has just won us the game.
hmm
But I think one of the things that a lot of Shatterpoint players haven't clued in as much, because relocation hasn't been as dominant of a list building design in the past, and I think that's changing more now with Thrawn especially. But displacement comes out and it ends up kind of struggling into the relocation matchup, because displacement doesn't tend to bring very wound focused characters. And so the relocation, like, there's not very many characters who are going to displace more than 2 characters. Like, sure, Darth Maul can go throw his lightsaber, shove someone off a point, and then like yank someone else off the point. And that's a great activation. Like, that's phenomenal. But then when the next activation is General Grievous and he moves like 3 characters, and it's like, well, General Grievous goes on a point, but he also moves another separatist battle droid, and then he uses Appetite for a Destruction, and like then gives another battle droid a movement, which puts them back on the point. You're just like, well, fuck, I moved 2 characters, but they moved 3,
Yeah.
and that just spirals out of control. And if you were just relying solely on displacement, those lists that are going to move like 3 characters every activation, you're just not going to displace fast enough. And I'm sure this is a thing because you've been playing so much relocation. I'm sure you've rolled over some displacement lists in recent history.
I would say so. It really just comes down to what you said. It's my opponent moved 1 to 2. Cool, I'm moving 3 to 4. And that's most relocation abilities in the game that we have currently are going to be like they're just doing more than you are. So they're everything that you spent, they're undoing and then some. And like you said, with them not being able to wound as much, their abilities are more focused on like their trees are like less about damage and more about shoves, hitting that ability on the tree, sometimes recover, all sorts of stuff like this. I think like Maul, I think is probably an exception because he does all the stuff and he can hit hard. But at the end of the day, even if you push somebody off and then kill somebody else over here. Well, I just got a battle tactic, and one card just undid half of what you did. Now I'm gonna go with my activation. Now I'm gonna reserve this guy. Cool. I'm gonna undo the other thing that you did. Okay. Now I'm gonna go with my actual unit that moves somebody else. Now I'm doubling down on what you did. Oh, and now I go with my actual guy, and now he's taking another point over here. Like there's just so much, and like it just nests with the nest with the nests with the relocation list that you're able to just overwhelm like all the work that somebody does in with displacement. And if they don't start getting wounds, like it doesn't matter. Like that's I don't want to steal your thunder with the segue, but it's like that's where you struggle with the relocation list is you want your pieces alive, because if they're alive, you just draw one card and move this guy all the way over here, and he can get on a point. Like it's great until it's not.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I don't mind you doing the segue because that is the thing. And this is kind of why we've probably never had a relocation list really kind of dominating the global meta. I'm sure there's been some cases where there hasn't been anything wounding heavy in your local meta, and you're just been like, man, the separatists, like Utah, right? They've always had great separatist players. And so that's definitely an area where relocation has really performed well. But you're right, when you come out of wound, like my first game with Thrawn, when you hit your battle tactics and you're like, well, both of my supports are wounded, like I literally I can't do what this thing wants me to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? And and it's just one of those things. And the same thing happens with the supports in separatists, right? So much of their relocation is moving the supports, and so if their droids are wounded, they're not going, like, sure, they may make an attack with it, but they're not getting back onto the points with those, Kalani, Kraken, Grievous. They can all give these characters a move and attack during their turn, but it doesn't necessarily help you with scoring if you don't get people onto the point to actually like break those ties, to actually, score those points. And so, yeah, it puts relocation in a tough spot when their characters are just hitting the dirt too fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so from here, we do want to hit that no list is just one thing, right? Iden, clearly a wounding list, right? But she has so much relocation in her kit, right? And then even Hask has a revenge effect. So there really isn't any list that is just one thing. And now, Dyzard, I know that you kind of wanted to hit on how some of these kind of cross over, and I think one of the great examples is Spectre.
Mm-hmm.
That if you're just running pure Spectre, or maybe pure Spectre with Rebel Commandos, right, you have Kanan for revenge triggers, and he's great, especially when you're running all Spectre. But that list is so much more. It's not bad damage wise. You've got Sabine, Kanan, and Hera who can all move characters onto points. So it's kind of a relocation list. And it like kind of hits reasonably hard too. It's not like Iden Vader hard, but it still puts some punishment. And you've got guaranteed displacement on Kanan with the force push, and then you've got kind of pseudo displacement in the sense that Ezra counts for 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what are your thoughts on Spectre and how it's kind of very multi-spectrum?
I think like I never really would have like come across this as like a conclusion for Spectre. I'm like, oh, Spectre's just revenge. That's all they're doing. They're not that they're so single face. Like that, this is what they want. They want you to hit them, so just don't hit them. Unless I talk to Sam Sweeten, because he showed me the way.
Yeah.
I played a few games with him, and every single time, like it's just like he's like, I love Hera. I'm like, why? Why do you love Hera so much? He's like, she just like there it's the relocation aspect of it, like between Hera and like the recoveries and moving stuff around like crazy, and then the let me stand somebody up and move them, and like there's just so many different things that they have going on with the relocation. And like talking with Sam a whole lot like really kind of made me like, okay, well maybe there's a lot more to Spectre than like there is at face value. And it's just because I wasn't playing a whole lot of Hera at the time. But they just do a little bit of everything, and they do it all fairly well. They really are a jack of all trades bunch when you're playing like almost full Spectre.
Yeah, Spectre really, I think it ends up being something where you actually end up with a lot of smaller of these matchups, right? It's not necessarily a list versus list, but right. But if you've got Hera on one side of the table and Kanan on the other side of the table, it is something where you can think about where you're like, I don't actually care if Kanan shoots one of my guys over on that side of the table right now. None of them are on points. Or it's someone he can't range attack. Maybe you've got, R2D2 and Lando on a point that they got on there because of a movement effect. And so Kanan can't actually shoot them from where he's at. So you don't care about his revenge trigger. And so you're kind of creating smaller matchups where maybe on that side of the board you do want to play a little bit more wounding focused. And if you can't get some wounds on Ezra, you're going to struggle with that team. You cannot let Ezra just always be relocated back onto points. It will wear you down. And so let's is there anything more that you wanted to say on Spectre, or do you think that's we don't need to
I
dive
think
into it too
I
hard?
think I think we can ghost them. Ah,
Yeah. Oh, appreciate the
wow.
pun, my man. We were trying to think of another good example of a real multi-threat list, and we ended up coming up with, say, like a Vader 2 Mando combination. That's maybe something like Vader 2 with Stormtrooper Sergeant, Fifth Brother, and then Mando with DTE and Dark Troopers. Do you want to tell the watchers and listeners what like makes this so multi-dimensional?
All right. So I think the biggest thing that this has is like Empire has a little bit of everything, and Empire is kind of just like flourishing in that at the moment. So Empire pieces having access to these types of tools, and Mando being so tag agnostic, like yes, he has like stipulations with tags, but it almost doesn't matter that much, so he can kind of go anywhere. Him
Yeah.
being one of the tankiest models in the game, he has a revenge trigger. Yay! That is really, really good because it's a reposition. I'm gonna get back on a point and I'm gonna heal before I do it. So that's really, really good. Cool. I got my revenge covered because that Mando revenge can make people spin wheels in their head about, okay, I gotta make sure that I don't do this because then Mando's just gonna take a point and then I'm not actually gaining anything this turn. Cool. Revenge trigger. Check. I got Vader too, who is basically designed to kill. If he doesn't kill, he goes back in the deck to try again. That is Vader too, and it's great. Like he does it very very well. He hits extremely hard, rolling 11 dice, needing to hit 5, and that's going to do 10 damage. That sounds real good with a great expertise tree to go with it. Oh, by the way, you also got Dark Troops there that are going to add strain. So now he's actually hitting 11 damage when he's rolling dice.
Yeah.
And Darks can kill stuff pretty easily too. So you got a whole bunch of wounding capability going on. Oh, let's talk about displacement. Number one, let's talk about anti-displacement. Dark troops can't be displaced, which is amazing. And
Well, they can't be pushed by
by abilities,
by the abilities.
yeah,
Like you can still displace them with
yeah, you can
shoves,
still
but
shove them.
the all the auto displacement, right,
Yeah,
doesn't work on them.
facts, and they
Or
can't be jammed.
diceless displacement.
There we go. So we got a little bit of that going on. Plus, they have really good shoves. Well, now you got Mando with Planet 2 that can just push somebody off of a point. You got Fifth Brother with Repulse that he could hit on the tree. You got a little bit of everything going on here. Oh, we forgot relocation. Oh, Vader kills something cool. I'm gonna move one of my guys onto a point. Mando's revenge trigger is a relocation. Oh, and then I have the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Stormtrooper Sergeant who has saved so many games because he
Yeah.
just moves people onto points. And when you're moving Fifth Brother onto a point from Stormtrooper Sergeant, his activation no longer feels dead. So like this list literally has pieces of everything and it does it very, very effectively. If you have not played Vader 2 Mando and you're okay with playing Empire, I highly recommend it. It is a good time.
Yeah, it is still light on the revenge. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think this list would shy someone away from wounding that much, but it's reasonably tanky, and Mando is at least going to slow that stuff down because he's so hard to wound himself that you're going to shove him off a point, but he's never going to stay shoved off a point if you want to get any wounding done. And also because of the list kind of naturally does that, like, oh, there's lots of things that take 1 damage or so, and Mando can top off those troops and keep them
Mm-hmm.
out of wounding ranges. So overall, it's interesting, and I didn't have this takeaway going into this episode, but I am kind of thinking that I should try Vader 2 Mando now.
It's really good. I had such a hard time dropping Vader from my list for Nova, but it was because I think this is where the bounty hunter box is going to be really good, is because like Thrawn wants pieces that Vader and Mando
Yeah.
have. So like, Bosk being able to come in there is going to be able to widen that up a little bit to where I can put Vader back in my main list, and I really look forward to that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I think the main thing that I want the people who are watching this video to kind of take away from this is, maybe maybe your premiere is struggling because you built two wounding combinations, or you leaning too heavy into wounding, and you're like, well, maybe the second half should do something a little bit different. Maybe that's something a little bit more displacement focused, or something a little bit more relocation focused. Help give your overall premiere some direction. And I also think that we're going to hit a point where a lot of the best lists in the game are going to be the ones who are above average in three or more of these categories. Right? I think it's pretty common that we can have two and be like good at two. But I think when you hit like the Spectre, right, where you're like, man, it feels like wounding is maybe slightly above average and your displacement is maybe only slightly above average, but you're also just like got great revenge, got great relocation. And it just creates problems where a lot of lists aren't going to deal with it. And so I want to bounce it back to you, Dyzard, before we kind of wrap things up. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts on this? What's your counter and how it should impact people's premier list building?
I think it really just comes back to something that you and I have been talking about lately and trying to like emphasize is like maintaining a goal of what your list is trying to achieve. And when you're building a list, what is your list actively going for? What are its keys to victory? And I think you can kind of closely relate these four topics as the keys to victory for a list. If am I achieving this? No. Okay, but am I at least achieving this, this, and this? Yes. Okay, cool. I'm okay with that. Like the way that I talked about the Vader 2 Mando, can you do that with your list? And if you don't, maybe something needs to be reevaluated. Not necessarily hitting all the blocks, but like you said, I think you should be hitting like 2 to 3 at least, with your strike teams and what your strike team pairings are, and not trying to shove all of it into one squad because then you're really going to come into some really bad list configurations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can look at things like one of my takeaways from this, and I don't think it's going to surprise anyone where I'm going to say that the Obi-Wan, the secondary, or Obi-2 is a very good character, like literally surprises no one. But if I want to make a relocation list like Separatists, maybe I do, rather than lean further into the relocation, and honestly, Obi-2's got some relocation anyway with his innate, but the fact that he could help protect my supports, right, with mind trick, that that might be the thing, that Obi kind of slows down the wounding strategy, which is what hurts relocation the most. So maybe if you really enjoy that playstyle, then you go, well, what can I do to protect my relocation models, protect the ones that I want to get back onto points, and what sort of things can I play to make it so that I can afford the force to do that? Or how do I reactivate models, like Long Live the Empire and things like that. And so I think there's more that kind of comes from this that might help clarify what you should do with a list to kind of start pushing those little min-max knobs, right? Where you just like you get the best combination that you can. So I really hope that this helps everyone. And Dyzard, I really appreciate you coming with me to explore this. What's your counter journey, so to speak.
Absolutely. It's been a good old time as always. I always
Yeah.
enjoy these conversations. So thanks for having me.
And we managed to do a conversation between Dyzard and I that didn't take 2 hours. So I'm going to call that a win.
We didn't even hit an hour. I'll call it a double win. Like, I'm
Yeah,
shocked.
we did a good job here. So listeners, just remember, what's your counter, and this will be the first kind of video for Shatterpoint that I've done on the Omnis Protocol channel, and I'm really happy that Dyzard got to be a part of the first one, and I'm certainly looking to do more of these. So close it out with the way that I always close things, and I just say later, nerds.